Welcome back to another segment of Behind the Scenes of the Waltons. Today, I'm very happy to be continuing my conversation with John Dayton and director Ralph Senensky. Something else I just wanted to share is that Ralph Senensky, for those of you who don't know, he has a birthday on May 1st. And on May 1st, Ralph Senensky will be turning 101 years old. So please join me in the comments in wishing Ralph Senensky a very happy birthday. Happy birthday, Ralph, and thanks for joining us. Please welcome back Ralph and John. That is a question that I've been asked, and which was interesting to me, that in television, I don't know if it's still true, but that you as the director, it sounds like you did not sit through all of the editing process of the episodes once done.
Oh no, I did.
Oh, did you? Okay.
From the beginning. So that in that case, I would do my cut. Then of course the producers got the final cut, and then I would go in and see it afterward.
Okay. And yet you said on The Warrior you weren't, either you didn't have time to make the notes because you talked about what a wonderful job Marge Fowler did on that. So at what point was her work that you weren't engaged with?
That's putting together the editor's assemblage. I don't think I did an assemblage. It was so complex, and there was so much film. There just was so much film.
So for our viewer, what does an assemblage mean?
Well, on the chicken feed, we filmed the show, and the editor then puts it together, based on the notes from the script supervisor. And I have to tell you, a lot of it is because when you're filming, and I learned this early on and used it, director's camera cut. You protected yourself by the way you filmed it and what you provided. And good editors followed that. It wasn't as if you had just a whole bunch of film and you have to say, no, I'll take this shot. When I filmed, I could almost see the movie in looking at my script. But so they put it together, and then I would come and look at it and then go through it with them where there were changes, finesses that I wanted. And we just worked that way.
Okay.
It was physical film, is that correct?
Oh, yes.
And it was cut by razor blade? How was that done?
Starting in the early days when they still had hot splices, and I have a great story there of an editor that I worked with in the 80s who had started in the business in the 30s. I was working with him on a pilot, Big Bend Country. His name was Gene Ruggiero. And he eventually won an Oscar for something later. But at this time, he was a young man in his 20s on the East Coast, passion for golf. And and he caddied at one of the big country clubs. But he loved to also play. And there was a big movie executive, East Coast executive, who was one of the members of the club and who would come out with foursomes to play. And Gene would caddy for him. And occasionally, if they came out and there were only three, this man, it was somebody connected with MGM, that I know. And he would ask Gene to be the fourth with him. And Gene would love it. And he did this a couple times, third time, fourth time. And the head of the, whoever was in charge of the assigning the caddies objected and said, "You're not supposed to be doing that. You're fired." And this was during the Depression.
Oh.
So Gene went to this executive, hoping that maybe he could talk to the club and get his job back. And the man said, "No, I've got something better. Why don't I send you out to the West Coast? And there's a movie studio out there. I'll send you out there, send him a letter, and I'll get you a job there." And Gene thought, great. And so the man did. He gave Gene a letter. He himself sent a letter to the MGM studio and put Gene on a train So Gene had this long flight across the country. During the time, he's thinking, "Oh, movies. Wonder what? Think maybe I'd like to be a cameraman." They got out there, reported to the studio, had his letter. They knew he was coming, and they had him assigned to the editing department. And in the editing department, so we get to tell you what happens there. In those days, and they were still doing that in the early '60s when I worked. The editor would go through, cut his film, put a paper cut, and then just roll it on. He didn't put it together. They sent it to the hot splicing department. And in the hot splicing department, the guy would sit there, take the two pieces of film. They had to lose a frame. They had to scrape. They put glue on, and then they had a press that was heated to clamp down to do it. And Gene hated it. Just sitting there all day doing nothing but cut, scrape, paste, fine. And he said occasionally he would just take the day off and go golf. But he came back to the studio every Thursday to pick his check up. Well, eventually he did work himself out of that department. He came into an editing room where he was now assisting the editor. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in the editing room, the old guys with the big bin with the books. And every time they took a piece of film and cut it, then they put it on there. Well,
it's like a clothesline. Yeah.
Huh?
It was like a clothesline.
Yeah. And the assistant editor, his whole thing was now to keep the pieces for the individual scenes together and just keep it all organized, because they weren't done with it. Eventually, when you needed to go back and do some re-editing, you had to go back into those same pieces and work it all together. And he did that. But you're learning. He was learning, and so that eventually they would let him. He would edit a scene, and he even got to the place where he did the full editing on a couple of the later Johnny Weissmuller Tarzan movies. And so he was now a film editor. And then word got out, Ernst Lubitsch, who had directed The Married Widow as a silent film with John Gilbert. And he was coming back to direct a big movie at Metro. And the head of the editing department was, assigning, going around to his top editors to appoint somebody to edit the film. And I guess Lubitsch had a reputation from when he did that movie. And none of the top editors wanted to do it. In fact, they just said, "No, I'm not doing it." And nobody would do it. And so the editor said, "Gene, you do it." So Gene went on and he did it. And it was Ernst Lubitsch directing Garbo in Ninotchka.
Oh, my goodness.
That was his first editing job. And of course, he stayed an editor from then on. But then Metro was so happy with the movie because it's just a great, great Garbo movie. Do you know it?
I know it.
I think I've seen it. It's been a while.
You must go back to it. Oh, it's wonderful.
It was funny.
It was funny.
Yeah.
Well, the ad said Garbo laughs. Anyway, they learned that Lubitsch was being brought back to the studio to do a movie, The Shop Around the Corner, with Margaret Sullivan and James Stewart. And so Gene called Mr. Lubitsch and told him he was happy he was coming back to the studio, and he hoped that he would be able to work with him on it. And Lubitsch said, "Of course, Gene." Well, meanwhile, now that Lubitsch has a different reputation because of Ninotchka, all the editors wanted it. And they're all fighting. They're fighting to get it. And Gene was assigned to a B movie. So he had to call Mr. Lubitsch again and say, "Mr. Lubitsch, I'm happy that you agreed that I could come to edit your next film, but I'm not going to be able to because I've been assigned this." And Mr. Lubitsch said, "That's all right. I'll wait for you."
Oh.
And he did.
Wow.
And Gene did edit The Shop Around the Corner. And
Oh my
he went on.
goodness. I didn't know that.
Well, that's because Gene didn't tell it to you. And I have another great Gene Ruggiero story. At that time, there's editing processes. They were inventing new machines, and it's no longer the movie-ola, but there was a table with a big screen, and then right in front of the film rolled by you this way. And what you did, you just went by, you snipped, made your edit, and it just went by. And Norman Rosemont, who was producing the film, and he did all of those specials, and he loved it. And he was raving about this machine. And Gene looked at me and shook his head and said, "You can't feel the film."
Mm. Now, on the Waltons, we never use a tape. We
No.
always shot that Kodak stock. I think it was 7 minutes we could go with a reel of film.
And
10 minutes. So the director was always bound by that, correct?
well, no, because the only one who was bound by that was Alfred Hitchcock when he wanted to do Rope and do it as if it was all one take. And
Oh God, yeah.
when he did that, but otherwise you just snipped away. And then by the end, many times, there would be a piece at the end of the reel that was too short to be used.
Right, and we saved those.
Oh yeah.
We saved those short ends, and yes,
And use them if you had a short, a short
Yeah.
scene. And that again was the job of this assistant editor that I told you about, working, picking up these pieces in the editing room.
Yeah, and I recall very clearly having to document yeah, every time how many feet were left off
Yes.
of, yeah, so it could be used again. But what I was getting to is, let's say you wanted to do a master, and it exceeded the time that you had.
You didn't.
Mhm.
You didn't. But you could come close. Edmund Goulding in the movie Claudia, Dorothy McGuire's first movie, he has a brilliant scene that is 10 minutes long that just roams all the way through the house. But what he did that Hitchcock wasn't able to do was Hitchcock didn't always get reactions because he was, he wanted to do it without cutting. But Goulding doesn't. You're not aware that he's doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's 10 minutes long. And Dorothy McGuire, Robert Young. It is just an incredible scene. And there is another scene that is even more miraculous, and that's the opening shot of Touch of Evil.
Oh yes.
Yeah. Russell Metty was a cinematographer on.
You bet he was.
He did our first few seasons of the Waltons.
Oh, I can do stories on Russell Metty.
That's where the Hollywood royalty that we had on our show is remarkable, and I'm always kicking myself for not knowing and not having an opportunity to hear those stories firsthand from the people, because I didn't know who they were.
Well, in the 30s, Russell Metty was a contract director of photography at RKO Radio Studios. I know that he was director of photography on Hepburn and Cary Grant in Bringing Up Baby. That's Russell Metty.
Yep.
And then that was in the 30s, and then in the 50s, when there was no longer an RKO Radio, that's when he went to Universal, and that's when he did Spartacus, and I think in Touch of Evil, and many others. When we went on the set, he at that point was probably a man in his 70s, and Russell Metty, and I was aware of this, Russell Metty never got out of his chair, did everything, had this great gaffing crew.
Yeah.
When I did the marathon, he was out on his feet during the whole show. That show was so complex. He was out on his feet. He was miraculous, as so many of them were.
Yeah.
That was my training ground.
And you're talking about our show, the episode, The Marathon, correct?
Yeah. Do you know the story of that one?
Tell us.
I came back. I came to the Waltons and did The Chicken Thief. That was my first one. I had been directing at that point for a dozen years, and I still had not broken into that class to do a pilot or a movie for television. So much of that was decided that they had to get the permission up at the networks. And when we're working in episodic television, Directors Guild of America, I always called it Directors Guild Anonymous.
Mhm.
I did the one show, and Lee Rich, they decided I was going to do The Black Waltons, A Dream for Christmas. And it was a 2-hour movie, a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful movie. And then it came back and after that, my next show was The Gift. And of course, Robert Jacks had produced both Chicken Thief and The Gift. And when I came back for the third show that season, The Cradle, one day Robert Jacks said, well, we're going to go down to the screening room and look at a film. I said, okay. So we went down and we watched. They shoot horses, don't they? And Jacks told me he had tried to get the option he wanted the option to do that as a movie, and he didn't get it. But the next season, all of a sudden, they're doing a marathon show on the Waltons, and he assigned me to it. So I knew that when he started, when he was making plans, that he had that. But what he didn't know was that when I was 10 years old, we had a dance marathon happen in Mason City, Iowa. And we used to go there every Friday night. So I knew about dance marathons. And that's one of the really personal shows that I got to do.
Yeah, and you talked about how challenging it was because you didn't have a full set to work on.
Oh, that's right.
It wasn't the full set because that never showed. The size of the floor for the Jackrabbit Run. They couldn't go. They just couldn't go without bumping into each other when you were in a bigger one. I mean, they really ran, and again, did a lot of coverage. And then in the editing room, you think you're aware of it, but it's being done by editing rather than actually shots that are showing it.
Can I switch to another episode? The Gift. Was it? Oh, well, another crier for me, another very emotional show. Did you cast the show? Did you cast Ron Howard?
Well, we had Pam Polifrone, who was so great at casting, and she would come on with a suggestion. And what do you do? Of course, you say yes, because I knew about Ron Howard for many years, about 13 years before, when I was on Playhouse 90. And Ethel Wynand, who was casting Playhouse 90, and this was back in the 50s, and she cast 8-year-old Ron Howard in a live 90-minute television show. I mean, those were just monstrous to execute. And with these great directors, Schaffner, George Roy Hill, Ralph Nelson, Frankenheimer. And this little kid did it. But then once he finished, there was another show at that point in rehearsal that also had a child actor in it. And the director didn't like him. He just, not that he didn't like him, he thought he just wasn't good enough. And so he complained to Ethel. So they brought Ron Howard back immediately, and they did another one. So I knew, and of course, there were Happy Days. There was the Andy Griffith show in between. I knew about him there, and it was while we were in production for The Gift that Ron got word that Happy Days had been picked up.
Yeah, it was such a
And-
thrill for all of us to have him on set because, of course,
Oh, he
we
was wonderful.
grew up. I grew up watching him as a boy on
Happy Days.
TV and film and stuff. So
Yeah.
yeah,
And he was such a good actor.
and such a nice person.
Yes.
We went out to Franklin Canyon on that, and it was the screaming scene. Do you remember that?
I sure do.
How did you approach that with Ron?
I just told him to do it. He did it.
Was it one take? I think it was.
Well, it's not one take. There's about 5 different shots.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
a series of shots, including the one where it gets to the end. And I wanted to do a full 3 circle. And I don't know if you know this, but the gift was Carol McKean, the story editor. That was the first of her scripts ever to be filmed.
Mm.
And I just thought she was dynamite. Loved Carol McKean.
But by the way, everyone should know, Ralph, you are the most prepared director I have ever worked with.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much to John and Ralph for sharing all of that wonderful information about your time on the Waltons and other aspects of Hollywood. The two of them just have the most amazing stories. So thank you for being here to share that with me. I will be back with more of our conversation and more of segments and Ask Judy and all kinds of things. So thanks for watching.